This is the Stephen Mansfield Podcast.
Well, welcome to the Stephen Mansfield Podcast. Great to have you with me here, where we talk about our times through the lens of faith and leadership, character, and history. I am sitting here in Nashville, Tennessee, first thing in the morning, November 6th, 2024, and Donald Trump is the next president of the United States. I got to tell you, quite frankly, I'm not surprised by the latter. I am surprised by the former, meaning I'm surprised we are so certain so early. You remember last time, it took days for us to know if we were even close, but the results were definitive, the results were in, and Donald Trump is the next president of the United States. Now, there's going to be a lot of processing, a lot of angst, a lot of discussion, a lot of media done about this. What I want to do is hit some highlights, actually 7 truths of the 2024 election. We already know some statistical matters and some trends that defined this election. I'd like to hit those here in this podcast, and then I'm going to give you some of my personal reflections. So let's get to it. Number one of the more interesting facts to me is how many fewer people voted than have in recent elections. I know we're talking about big numbers and we're all preoccupied with what Kamala Harris took and what states Donald Trump took and this possible sweep of the House and the Senate and everything in the entire country for the Republicans. However, my first stat is this. Over 134 million people cast their vote in the 2024 presidential election. And that sounds impressive, except it's down from the 154 million who voted in 2020. So in other words, in the last presidential election, 20 million more people voted. Now, this is significant. We're finding that fewer people are registered. A lot of people were disillusioned in this election. And so even though it's got a lot of people happy and everybody on the right's very happy and everybody on the left is grieving and Richard Gere apparently is going to go live in Spain, the fact is that 20 million fewer people voted in this election, 134 million down from 154. And by the way, I've made this point before, but bear in mind that about half of those people voted for Trump. So whenever any politician gets up the day after an election and says they have a mandate, it ain't so. About 75 million people voted for Donald Trump, but that's in a country of 350 million. And I only mention that not to diminish his victory, but to say that obviously a huge number of people didn't care, voted for the other side, or just aren't old enough or firm enough to worry about American politics. So remember that number, 134 million, down from 154 million in 2020. The second thing, and this is the real story of this election, and that is there are people out there I call stealth voters, and Trump has a huge amount of them. And the stealth Trump voters delivered for him, and they are the story in this election. If you're wondering why not one single poll showed this result, the result that we're talking about this morning and will be, by the way, for years, at least in academic circles, it's because the blue-collar, common family, Walmart, Kmart, America, they have their values. They feel oppressed by the elite. They feel oppressed by globalism. They feel oppressed by some of the cultural trends. They're going to vote for Trump. They're conservatives, but quite frankly, their culture has just cowed them a bit. So they don't put up yard signs and they don't answer pollsters and they don't announce to their friends who they're going to vote for. They've already paid for their values in some significant ways, but they showed up for Trump. That's why this couldn't be anticipated in advance. How can a pollster who has people who won't talk to them, isn't talking to anybody else, keeps their values quiet, but fully intends to vote for Trump, how can a pollster figure that out? How can the press report that? So I want you to remember that in this election, it's the stealth Trump voters. Like a lot of my Southern relatives, I'm a guy who, because I was a military brat, grew up in Europe, but I have lots of South Georgia relatives, and they are conservatives, and they are Christians, and they're concerned about where this country is going, and they don't like the coastal elites, but they're also very cautious about saying publicly what they're going to do. They don't want to lose their job because their boss might be a Democrat, and they don't want people upset with them at church because they might vote for Trump when they might not vote for Trump. And by the way, my family has a lot of relationship with blacks who might be Democrats in the South, etc. You understand the thinking, but they showed up in large numbers for Trump. Now let's talk, number 3, about some surprising statistics. Half of voters under 30 voted for Trump. Now, this blows up the narrative that Trump voters are largely well-to-do older whites. It's not true. We're going to see that in the stats that I'm going to talk about in a minute. But we now know that just about half of voters under 30 voted for Trump. We'll be parsing out and trying to figure out in academic circles exactly why they did it. We're not quite sure of that yet. But the assumption, of course, is that the young tend to vote left. And when they get older and they get houses and they get married and they get kids and they get jobs and they have a little wealth and a little skin in the economic game, they tend to vote more conservative to protect what they have. That did not bear out in this election. So number 3, intriguingly, half of all voters under 30 voted for Trump. Obviously, that means half voted for the other side, but we've seen it as high as 90% for the more left-leaning candidate. And here it's 50-50. Another interesting thing, number 4, black voters. Now, Ms. Harris is a woman of color, and she does very well with the African-American community. However, blacks did not vote for her in the same numbers that they did for Joe Biden. Joe Biden got 9 in 10 blacks vote for him in the last election. That's just a simple way of saying it. 9 out of 10, in other words, 90% of blacks voted for Joe Biden in the last election. But we're going to end up landing in this election somewhere around 8 in 10 or 7 in 10. So Joe Biden, older white man, pulled more blacks than did Kamala Harris. Again, students and analysts will be talking about this for years, but she didn't pull the black community as much. And I think the answer is going to be that especially black men were not as drawn to her. I think that may be the answer. That may be exploded in time. But I think in this election, black men were not as drawn to Kamala Harris. By the way, she's further to the left than Joe Biden, and black men are skewing conservative. So we'll see how that plays out and what motivated black women as opposed to black men. But the reality is fewer blacks, and a significant number, almost 20%, voted for Harris than voted for Biden in 2020. Intriguing. Another thing that's interesting, half of all Hispanics voted for Harris and half voted for Trump. But Biden got 6 in 10 Hispanics. So here again, just like with black voters, fewer Hispanic voters voted for Harris than voted for Biden. So think about this. This older white guy who's been in D.C. politics for 50 years pulled more blacks and more Hispanics than Kamala Harris. I'll come to a conclusion about that in just a few moments. There's no question, all exit polls show that the reason people lean towards Donald Trump, even if they didn't like his callousness, even if they didn't like his vileness, even if they thought he made big mistakes in the last election, it was basically 3 things: the economy, the border, and global greatness. In other words, that the U.S. is esteemed and strong worldwide. Those 3 things: the economy, the border, and global greatness. And I'm going to say, I'll talk about this more in a minute, but there's a basic disconnection between what you might call the elite, certainly the political elites, and blue-collar Kmart America. There's just no question about it. Because global elites, coastal elites, etc., don't feel the economic pinch as much as blue-collar mom and dad, don't hurt over the border as much as blue-collar mom and dad in America, and frankly, aren't that concerned about the strength of America, the greatness of America, which, of course, Donald Trump talks about all the time. So keep those things front and center. Abortion did not decide this election. That's pretty amazing given the Supreme Court ruling in Dobbs and the fact that now there's a battle at every state for abortion, because that's what this did. The Supreme Court did not ban abortion. It simply pushed the decision to the states. And man, is there upheaval about that. But abortion does not rank even in the top 5 of why people voted. They voted because for Trump for the economy, the border, and what we might call global greatness. Now, here's the most interesting stat, and I've left it for last. Very intriguing to me. Men and women split exactly the same over Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Let me say it another way. 50% of men voted for Donald Trump. 50% of men voted for Kamala Harris. 50% of women voted for Donald Trump. 50% of women voted for Kamala Harris. This is stunning, given what we were told by the media, that abortion and the Dobbs decision by the Supreme Court would make all the difference. It didn't. In fact, it didn't even figure in the top reasons people voted, and half of all female voters voted for Donald Trump. Half voted for Kamala Harris. Astonishing that you have a serious female contender for president, perhaps the most serious in American history. She certainly came closer than anyone else. And only 50% of women voted for her, and only 50% of men. Now, those are some statistics that grab us right up front. Whatever is said in the future, whatever else is parsed out, these are the stats that determined the election. That Kamala Harris did not pull as well as Joe Biden. And Donald Trump, despite all of his stumbles, despite all of his playing Hamlet for weeks at a time, being upset and grousing about the wrongs done to him, he not only won, he's probably going to win handily. And people excused him and voted for him in greater percentages, certainly of minorities, than they had since Joe Biden. Unbelievable. Now, here are some of my personal views. I do not want to be harsh. I do not want to harm Mrs. Harris, Kamala Harris, Vice President Harris. However, the reality is that this election is the story of a weak candidate. I'm sorry to say it, and I certainly don't think that Trump is Jesus. But in this election, there's no question, Kamala Harris, positioned by the Biden administration, positioned by the Democratic committee, they excited to have a woman, excited to have a good-looking woman, excited to have a woman who is former Attorney General of California, excited to have a woman who is vice president. But despite all those resume issues, the reality was she was a weak campaigner. It's now well known, for example, that when she was elected vice president, that she did not know what to do. She stuck very close to Joe Biden, attended all the cabinet meetings, stuck very much close to home. And the staff, the President Biden's staff, had to try to figure out how to peel her off of him. And that, by the way, this is the admission of those in the administration, tried to figure out what to do with her. They finally made her border czar, which, as we now know, hurt her in this election. She made no difference, but she was saddled with responsibility for a policy, frankly, that predated her. So the reality is, and I say this, I'm not a vicious person in American politics. I don't like to hurt people personally, but she was a weak candidate. She made good speeches. Every politician has to. Terrible in interviews, gave few interviews, often mangled her words. If you look up word salad in a dictionary or online, you're probably going to hear some reference to Kamala Harris. She was a weak candidate. Now, despite that statement, she broke records for fundraising. She had huge celebrity endorsements. She had significant endorsements from Trump administration officials, and she had some of the largest crowds in American history. In fact, her electoral season since being nominated post the Biden era, post Biden's decision not to run, was one of the most stunning electoral seasons in American history, and still she lost. It's going to come down, I'm sorry to say, to her simply being a weak candidate. And I had a moment this morning as I was watching TV and reviewing the returns where I felt sorry for her. She's relatively young, and her political career is not over, but severely damaged. With all the advantages she had, with all the money she had, with all the endorsements she had, without having to actually go through running in a primary at all. She never had one primary vote. she lost, and lost pretty badly. It's very likely the Republicans will sweep the entire gamut. House, Senate, governors, White House, everything. Pretty stunning. Number two, it's pretty obvious, these are just my personal views, it's pretty obvious that the prosecutions did not hurt Trump, but they may have helped him. Polls are showing, if they can be trusted, that most people think that the prosecutions of Donald Trump were politically motivated. And I'll leave you to your own opinion about that. But just as a political matter, they clearly did him no harm. People did not say, well, he's a convicted criminal and therefore I'm not going to vote for him. Obviously, some people on the left did. They voted for Kamala Harris, but it didn't keep him out of the presidency. And by the way, when people vote for a Republican House and Senate, they're saying, we want you guys to cooperate with the guy in the White House and get some things done. So they're behind Trump, the people who voted for him. They didn't see the prosecutions, the criminal charges as any kind of barrier, and that's unbelievably significant. There's a third thing that I want to mention before I just bring it to a close, and that is it's important to watch the press now. I was amazed this morning watching Morning Joe, hosted by my friend Joe Scarborough, that a lot of the people on that show, who are probably Democrats, were actually hammering the press, hammering the reporting, criticizing the left-leaning nature of our society. In other words, they're boomeranging a bit. So they realize that the left, and specifically the press, have gone too far. That's what they were saying this morning. It was actually very moving and a little bit disingenuous in the sense that that show is, moderate to liberal, certainly not strongly conservative. Even Joe Scarborough, former Republican congressman, is not as conservative as he used to be. But I think that you're going to see some serious recriminations against the press and the left-leaning drift of our society. This morning, people on that show were decrying the insistence for certain pronouns, were talking about their kids, their daughters, their sons going to college and having to sit in the classroom quietly and not raise their hands and not raise objections. I mean, pretty significant. So you're going to see a bit of a negative feeding frenzy as the press and the pundits hammer the leftward drift of our society. What will it produce? I don't know. And the final thing in my little analysis is I'm keenly aware that the elites, as we might call them in our society, are simply out of touch with the average guy. In fact, I think it's important that we see this election as a blue-collar revolution. It was middle America, middle-income America, blue-collar, Kmart America, as I'm calling it, that rose up and motivated and got mobilized and voted for Donald Trump. And the elites, those who make political decisions, those high-ranking in D.C., those wealthy ones, those who control media, they were kind of out of touch. I mean, think about it. Why did people vote? Number one, the economy. Well, if you're making millions, if you're a multimillionaire, and that's most of the folks you'll see on television hosting shows and so on, you're not that touched by a 20% increase in the price of eggs. You're not that touched by higher airfare, etc. And so you don't feel the visceral sense of things declining as the guy on the street does. You aren't that affected by the borders. You live in New York, you live in Washington, D.C., you live in Los Angeles. You're not that affected by people pouring over the border. But if you're blue collar in South Texas, your family's threatened, your jobs are taken, this is what you believe. So think about that in that sense. And of course, the weakness of Joe Biden in office sends a signal internationally that embarrasses the average guy who maybe served in the military and then came back and got married and has kids and lives a middle-class life in America. He feels the bite of America losing prestige in the world. And all of those are reasons that he voted. But elites don't feel it as much. So this election was a blue-collar revolution. Stealth Trump voters feeling keenly the decline of America that Donald Trump talks about all the time turned out for him. And it is very likely that this is going to be a record-breaking election statistically, but certainly the House, the Senate, the governor race, and the White House are all owned by Republicans at this point. I think the House is still in question as I speak right now, but it's looking good for the Republicans. Much more to come, much more statistics to process, much analysis. You'll be watching it. But these things are true. They are not going to change with analysis, and they have determined this election. God bless America.
Stephen Mansfield is a New York Times best-selling author, a popular speaker, and a frequent faith and culture commentator in international media. His groundbreaking books on faith and society include The Faith of George W. Bush, The Search for God in Guinness, Mansfield's Book of Manly Men, and Lincoln's Battle with God. Learn more at stephenmansfield.tv.